You think Trump's a sociopath?
Absolutely. I mean, a friend of mine says if you look up the word sociopath in a medical dictionary, if you look at the qualities or attributes of a sociopath, and then think to yourself, who does that remind me of?
Well, Lord Patten, thank you so much for inviting us into your wonderful home here in Barnes, surrounded by lots of photographs of your long and illustrious career, which we're going to talk about. As I say, you've had an extraordinarily long and varied career, perhaps more so than anyone I can think of in contemporary politics. You grew up in the post-war 1950s, came of age politically in the 60s. I want to talk a lot about contemporary politics, but just for a moment, when you look back at the politics of that time, now, in your 80th year, what do you think remains? Is there anything left of that politics and political world you grew up in, or has it largely disappeared, do you think?
There's not much of that left, partly because there was a sort of serious courtesy about politics, much more than there is today.
Courtesy?
Yeah. I think that there was also, underpinning everything politically, a real consensual approach to making a welfare democracy run. Gatescalism really meant what it said, the combination of conservative and Labour views on managing the economy. So I think that was all different. And of course, we were more important. We were more important in the world. We didn't have any doubts about that. And we were more self-confident about our role in the world. But I think it was a period in which things seemed to be getting better, rather calmly, year by year.
A much more homogenous country.
Yeah, it eventually became rather complacent, particularly I think in relation to public ownership and trade unions, and that was where Margaret Thatcher came in. But I mean, I was born on the day that the German army was driven out of Crimea by Ukraine and the Russians. And all of my life has been, in those years, was about post-war generation, about recovery. My wife's father was killed before she was born in Normandy. And she discovered when she was looking into her past a few years ago that he'd been killed by what is called friendly fire. So we were growing up against that background of a terrible war in which, 80 million people died? Coming not long after another war in which so many had died. And America really was our best friend, and we had a real special relationship with us. And I might have felt more pro-American for one particular domestic reason. My dad, who'd been a professional musician until the war and then was in the RAF, after the war was a music publisher. And lots of the music he was publishing was American. And lots of the stars that he would occasionally bring home were American. So I had a very positive view of America, which was increased when I got a scholarship there after university. And I think it was a time of almost unbridled optimism. That's very different, and it's created a different atmosphere then. My family weren't particularly political. We had the Conservative Club was at the end of the road, but I don't think they ever set foot in it.
You've already said, and I think it's something that really does maybe distinguish the politics of our age. You've mentioned in passing the shadow of the war, which, although you weren't cognizant of, you weren't there for, you were just about born, your generation, but growing up in the shadow of that war. Do you think it's the case that maybe one of the defining features of the politics of our own age now is that the memory of that shadow has now all but disappeared, that we've forgotten it, and that we've forgotten the lessons which perhaps your generation were very keenly aware of?
Yes, I do, and I think it's particularly relevant to the present discussion about public expenditure. I wonder how much an 18-year-old or a 25-year-old now, I've sort of half had this discussion with some of my grandchildren, would understand that we really do have to spend more money to defend ourselves, because we're living in a much more difficult age and a much more difficult environment. And I think that's a lesson which was learnt the hard way in the 1930s and 40s. But of course, throughout that period, we were beginning the business of reaping the peace dividend. And now we've got to start paying to keep that peace. But I do think that there was a more general view of the world being divided between bad and evil, and that was particularly the case until the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire in Europe.
But also perhaps there was something in being, I imagine the world you grew up in, the political world you grew up in, was very sceptical of grand designs, very sceptical of the politics of division, of the politics of people coming along, of them and us, because you'd sort of seen it in the 1930s, or you were aware of it in the 1930s.
To some extent, although socialism still, when you read Tony Crosland and others, was still about a system, a belief that there was a system which would give you the answers to how to get through life with all its predicaments, a map for it. And I've never really believed in that. It's what's prevented me becoming a socialist, I think.
Well, on that, I mean, you weren't from a particularly wealthy family, affluent family.
No, I wasn't.
What
My mum would hate to hear you say that. My mum was wonderful, but she would hate me to say we were sort of lower to middle class.
Was she a social climber?
No, but she when we moved house when I was about 11 in Greenford.
In West London. In
West London. When we moved house, I remember her describing it as moving into the best street in Greenford. But she was absolutely lovely. She'd married my dad when they'd met at a gig in Exeter, when he was not only a drummer in a band, but an Irish Catholic drummer in a band. Can you imagine anything more shocking in Exeter in the 1930s? And they were hugely in love, and there was never any argument about that. But she was undoubtedly felt quite strongly that she wanted to see my dad get on.
So what was it that you used to the Conservative Party then? Was it her influence?
She would have voted Conservative because she was socially conservative.
What was your earliest political memory? What drew you into politics?
My earliest political memory is when I was at secondary school. I'd been to a local Catholic primary school, very good old-fashioned primary school. And I got a scholarship from that to the local Catholic independent direct grant school. So I remember when I was at this independent school, going along with a group of friends from school during the election campaign, shouting at a Labour candidate, "What about the private schools? What about the private schools?"
Nothing changed.
Rather shameful now, but that's the first political memory I think I have.
By the time you go into politics, of course, and you become elected as MP for Bath, Margaret Thatcher is beginning her period as Prime Minister. She was not a consensus politician, or at least certainly that's not what she became. Nonetheless, and your politics and hers were at variance, nonetheless you were, to some extent, I think you would have found her appealing, an interesting political figure. What was it about her?
She didn't believe that the Conservative Party was a sect. She believed it was a broad church. And she would never have regarded me as anything other than wet.
Just to explain to younger listeners to what that means.
Wet means sort of wishy-washy on the left of the Conservative Party.
As opposed to the dries.
As opposed to the dries.
The hard edge.
Hard edge.
Thatcherite.
None of this business. None of this business about trying to carry consent. Just get on with it. But there were several things about her which tend to have got lost. She wasn't really ideological. Of course, she would talk about the road to serfdom.
Hayek's book.
Hayek's book. I do not believe for one moment that she ever read The Road to Serfdom. She used to have little bits of scraps of paper in her handbag with quotations which people had given her. And if she'd read The Road to Serfdom, she can't possibly have agreed with it, because the last part of it is all about the importance of having a European currency. She was incredibly kind personally. Not to her colleagues.
Not to you.
Yeah, to me, because I mean, she advanced my career. I remember, all right, a personal story. One of our daughters now, middle-aged mum, when she was 2, got badly burnt on her arm. She grabbed hold of the bar of a fire and almost lost her hand. And Margaret Thatcher always remembered it. And at party conferences, people would bake her a cake, and she'd always send me off with the cake to give to Laura. But I never saw Margaret Thatcher or heard Margaret Thatcher be rude to a liftman, a chauffeur. She was a very kind person.
But you understand, I mean, some people listening to this, the last thing they think of, the last virtue that they think of when they think of Margaret Thatcher is kindness. They may think of other virtues, but they certainly don't think of that. Why do you think that there was such a variance between that perception and what you say she was like? Because some people will find that incredible, what you say.
Because it was easier to take her, what she quite wanted people to think was self-description.
The Iron Lady.
The Iron Lady and all that. And she did, of course, have to do some very tough things.
It is extraordinary, isn't it, Lord Patten, that, you know, Margaret Thatcher became Conservative leader half a century ago, 1975. She became Prime Minister in 1979. She left office when I was 1 year old in 1990. And yet she is still, to this day, in fact more so it feels than ever, she's beatified by the Conservative Party. Conservative Party leaders are still asked to compare themselves to her.
By beyond the Conservative
and
Party.
Beyond the yes, indeed so.
I mean, she made it possible for the Labour Party to have Tony Blair as leader.
Well, indeed, her influence continues to loom extremely large. Is that a problem for the Conservative Party when Conservative leaders are given a litmus test of Thatcherism, a political movement which was developed in the 1970s? Is that a problem for the Conservative Party now?
I'm not sure it really is. I mean, I think her great achievement was to make Britain governable.
She's gone into lore and legend, and people perhaps misunderstand who she truly was and what she was really about.
Yeah, I think that is true. I think it also didn't help dispel that myth. Like a lot of other old people, maybe me, you become more like you're thought to be as you get older, even if you're not, even if you haven't changed very much.
What do you mean by that?
Well, she became more attracted to sound ideological as she got older.
She became a caricature of herself.
She was happy to have a character. She was happy to play up to that caricature, I think. So she was saying things about Europe, for example, after she left office, that she'd never ever have done when she was in office. I think the real problem for the Conservative Party is not the inheritance of Thatcher, but it's Europhobia, which has, I think, shot it to pieces.
But didn't Thatcher help create that?
Well, if you read the famous Brussels speech...
The Bruges speech.
The Bruges speech, I mean, sorry.
1988.
Just shows how long ago I read it. If you read that, it's actually, a lot of it is perfectly sensible, and people wouldn't disagree with it. But she'd never have led a campaign to leave the European Union. She was no Farage, I mean, you know.
You think she would have argued to remain?
Absolutely. She fought to remain in the earlier referendum on the European Union. She was instead in favour of remaining.
What do you think she'd make of Trump? How do you think she was famous for cultivating a relationship with an American President, Reagan, who some people have compared to Trump in some ways, and indeed when he comes along...
It's very unfair.
Perhaps,
terribly unfair.
Perhaps, not least because he'd been governor of California and so on, but nonetheless, he was from a sort of acting background. People said he wasn't serious, all of these sorts of things. She was obviously very charmed by him and formed a very deep relationship with him. What do you think she would have thought of Trump?
Well, she didn't mind with Reagan saying things she knew he wouldn't like and agree with. And my favourite example of that is after the Americans had sent troops into one of our colonies in the Grenada, yeah. And there is a story about her phoning up the White House, demanding to be put through to Reagan. And he comes on the line, and she gives him a terrible earful. And halfway through this, while she's still ranting away, he puts his hand over the phone and turns to his staff and says, "Isn't she wonderful?" and you know, he was rational. I don't think this sociopath in White House would be capable if you answered back. When leaders say anything critical about him, there's immediately another 50% tariff slapped on their goods. I mean, it's outrageous.
You think Trump's a sociopath?
Absolutely. I mean, a friend of mine says if you look up the word sociopath in a medical dictionary, and if you look at the qualities or attributes of a sociopath, and then think to yourself, who does that remind me of?
How do you think Starmer's dealing with Trump?
Well, I guess not too badly, but I wish there was a bit more Carney in the way he handles him. And
I.e. Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime
yeah,
Minister.
I do think it's a bit. We shouldn't have to be so reverential and self-demeaning. And for me, there was a particularly yucky moment when, at that first meeting, he produced that envelope from his pocket of an invitation to make a state visit. I thought that was. So I don't think in international politics you should take the view that self-respect has nothing to do with self-interest.
Trump asks us for assistance to assist Israel in Iran, i.e. use of our bases and so on, perhaps more than that. What do you think Starmer should say to him?
I'm interested in what Congress and the Senate have to say, because constitutionally you shouldn't, in effect, go to war with another country unless the Senate and Congress are on your side. Secondly, I think I'd say to Trump, we haven't, of course, got a very good record, either you or us, collectively, of dealing with Iran. And I hold absolutely I don't have any support for what Iran have done in relation to its proxies around the region. And I don't like a government made up of right-wing clerics. When I was first a European Commissioner, we thought we would try to negotiate a fairly basic ground floor trade and cooperation agreement with Iran as a way of trying to influence and get them to be sensible about the centrifuges and so on, but also to get them involved in the wider free trade project. And I went out to see somebody who was then regarded as a moderate cleric, who was president, called Khatami. And he had a very intelligent foreign minister called Karzai. And he began by saying, how would you like to do this meeting? Would you like to do it in English or French? So I swallowed hard and said, well, if you're happy with English, that will be fine by me. So he said, okay, but if you want French, one or two other languages we can do as well. And he and every one of these vice ministers had a doctorate from an American or European university. So these were not idiots.
Do you think Israel is behaving, some people have suggested that it's starting to behave like a rogue state. Do you think that it is?
Well, I'm very careful what I say about Israel, because if you cross an imperceptible line, you fetch up being accused of anti-Semitism. I don't think it's anti-Semitic to criticize Netanyahu. I don't think it's anti-Semitic to criticize the way that the Palestinians have been treated in Gaza and the West Bank. And I don't think it's in Israel's interest to treat them in that way. Because I think that the only solution in Israel-Palestine is two states.
Do you understand those who are concerned that war crimes have are being committed. Indeed, some
Yes,
people
I do.
suggest even genocide.
What I'm surprised is that anybody can argue that what Israel have done isn't in breach of international law. I mean, what is international law? If it doesn't include considerations like starving people into submission.
Is Israel endangering its own security and indeed our security?
Yes, I do.
In a
I
way
think
that
it's
acting?
endangering its own. When I was a European commissioner, I had really good relations with some of those who'd been who'd been supporters of Rabin and had been at Camp David with Rabin. Rabin, who said, "My message to Palestinians is simple: enough blood, enough tears." And he was then assassinated by a right-wing Israeli.
Is Netanyahu dangerous? A dangerous man?
I think if we were to follow him in the logic of what he's trying to do is to produce a one-state Israel. If anybody ever said I was anti-Semitic, I'd want to cut their head off. What I do think is that it is not sensible of Israel, if it wants long-term peace, to act in a way which will produce future generations of people who hate Israel.
Are there, in the way that Netanyahu and Israel and now the US are talking about Iran, do you think there are Iraq war parallels? About the threat of nuclear bombs, WMD, so on and so forth?
Well, I think there are lots of parallels in a number of respects. I mean, I heard one of our most distinguished diplomats yesterday talking about whether or not Iran was about to produce a nuclear weapon. And I just remembered that he was one of the people who was telling us some years ago that Iraq was had all sorts of weapons up its sleeve which it would use. I think we threw away a chance of coping with Iran's nuclear ambitions when Trump walked away from the Obama agreement. And what he's now hoping he can do is to bomb Iran back to something like that Obama agreement. It's absolutely crazy, loopy.
And in terms of how Starmer is handling Trump, I mean, he's got various people there in the United States for him now, including, I mean, you know, international diplomacy very well. How do you think Lord Mandelson is doing as our ambassador?
I don't talk about Lord Mandelson. My only view on Lord Mandelson is every story ends in tears.
We cannot but talk about China and how they fit into all of this. Of course, you were the last governor of Hong Kong. Just with regards to Iran, well, obviously China is a player, even in that story. Where do you think, if we take the sort of big pictures and big pieces of geopolitics right now, Russia, Ukraine, we see Iran, the United States, the rise again of great power politics, what is China's long-term, in your view, what is its long-term ambition and how it sees itself fitting into that game?
Well, its long-term ambition was to outstrip the American economy, with the consequences in terms of security and so on. And it hasn't and won't achieve that. It will do very well in some areas of technology, partly because of the investment it's made in them, partly because the Chinese, this is a sort of awful patronizing generalization, are so smart. I don't think it is possible to govern for a long time while denying people the ability to express their views to one another, and by denying your own history. To take a simple thing. The way that they've attempted, Chinese Communist Party, to snowbake Tiananmen out of the history books. I was in Tiananmen Square until about a week before the soldiers went in, because I was then I think I was the vice chairman of the Asia Development Bank, having a meeting there. I had a great friend who was the Observer correspondent in Beijing. He'd been
So that's the government.
He'd been an old-time sort of Maoist, but the more he saw of China, the more he's flipped. And he's in Tiananmen, surrounded by students, and they start hearing pop, 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 pop. One of these kids takes him by the sleeve and says, "Don't worry, Grandpa, they're not using live rounds." At which point this kid falls dead in his arms, covered in blood. And you can't pretend that never happened. You can try. I remember my wife saying that one of the schools where she was chairman of the governors, they had quite a lot of mainland Chinese girls and a lot of Hong Kong girls. And she was told by one of the teachers that they were having a discussion one day about the tank man. The tank man came up, and the girls from the mainland had no idea who it was. So then the subject of Tiananmen Square came up, and all the girls from the mainland thought it was simply part of Beijing. They had no notion of anything else. Now, you can't keep that sort of thing out of the public dialogue, out of the public narrative forever. And there's a cost for you when you...
Do you feel that we let them down, Hong Kong? Do you feel you let them down?
No. It was a peculiarly difficult situation, both for us and for the Chinese. We were used to having colonies which we would prepare in the 50s and 60s for independence, for autonomy. And we'd put in place, we'd sort of skybomb with them with copies of E. Jennings on the British Constitution. We'd have judges with wigs, and we'd establish a bicameral legislature. And we'd light the blue touch paper and blast it all off into outer space. And sometimes it would go into orbit and sometimes it wasn't. Hong Kong was never like that, because Hong Kong was never going to become independent under the terms of the agreement, which was 99 years old when we left. There'd been times well before my arrival in Hong Kong when the Chinese had intervened to try to snuff out any debate about Hong Kong's democracy, saying to British governments, if you treat Hong Kong like that, if you talked in Hong Kong like that, they'll think they're going to be like Singapore or Malaysia, and they're not, you know. So it was embarrassing and difficult for us. And it was embarrassing and difficult for the Chinese. Because when we left, they said Hong Kong's never been a colony. It's been an occupied territory.
Do you think that they will, at some point, attack Taiwan?
They would be so lunatic to do that you can't believe that people who are so smart would ever manage it or think very hard about it. Why would they be lunatic? It would destroy the Chinese economy. Imagine the insurance costs, for example, take a very limited point, of exporting or importing goods to China through the Taiwan Straits if you were blockading Taiwan or fighting a war. And beyond that, there are much bigger things that would happen, the drying up of foreign investment in Taiwan. So I think it would be a disaster for them, and I don't think that I believe they're completely crazy.
Starmer and Reeves seem pretty clear that they want to get close to China, or get as close to China as the Americans will allow them to be. What do you make of that approach? What do you make of their approach towards China so far in their first year in office? Got the Chancellor having gone there, Prime Minister wants to go there.
I hope they don't delude themselves into thinking that the only way you can do business with China is by accepting that the Chinese have the mandate of heaven. In the years before I was governor, you can look up the figures, British exports to China and investment in China had fallen. The years I was in Hong Kong, our exports went up by higher than any other OECD country. So I never believed that the Chinese ultimately did business on any other terms than others. I mean, they threaten, but basically they buy what they need and what they want at the best price they can get.
I want you to help me unpack a sort of what feels like a paradox of politics at the moment, which is that we're 10 years on from the referendum, from the Brexit referendum. The polling is very clear that most British people believe Brexit to have failed. Even leavers, many leavers, think that for one reason or another it's failed. And yet, if we think about who is doing all of the intellectual running in politics at the moment, who is leading in so many ways British politics at the moment, it remains one of the architects and driving forces of that entire effort.
Farage.
Nigel Farage.
I think it's quite polite to call it intellectual driving forces.
Well,
Farage is the sort of guy who drives you out of your favourite pub. He's the sort of guy who arrives in the saloon bar suddenly, wearing red trousers and a cravat, and bangs on about everything, Mr. Know-all. And most people in those circumstances depart the pub straight away. And I'm not quite sure why he's still got some shelf life in the pub.
Why do you think it is?
I think it's because of partly of gutlessness in taking him on, and partly because of the squeeze on living standards over the last few years. And people want somebody to blame. And somebody to blame out there can be Europe or the establishment or all these people who allegedly know best. We've got university degrees and so on. There's quite a lot of that around. But you're entirely correct that it is astonishing that nobody really, apart from I think Labour is starting to do it, has faced up to the consequences of Farage and.
Does that include the media as well?
Brexit. Yeah,
BBC?
some of the media. I don't want to get into an argument with some of them, but yes, it does include some of the media. When
the BBC as well?
When Keir Starmer, who was a very good musician himself apparently in the past and likes classical music, was doing a program and asked what his favourite piece of music was, he said Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. At which point, of course, some of the populist press. So it just shows he hasn't. He's a real European, doesn't really care about other things because of the Ode to Joy and the last chorus in the Beethoven Symphony. I mean, it's absolutely pathetic.
Do you think the BBC does a good enough job scrutinising Brexit?
I think it's very difficult for them because they're in a sensitive position in which, even if they give a rather balanced report about Brexit, it's there goes the BBC again, establishment voice, not listening to people. And I think Brexit was a huge scam on the public. And I think they're very reluctant to say, how could we possibly have believed that leaving our biggest single market next door was going to be other than a bad thing?
Well, where are these arguments, Lord Patten, from your part of the party, from the centre-right? Where does the centre-right in the Conservative Party still exist?
Yeah, and they do hear them. I mean, you ever listen to an interview with Michael Heseltine? I'm having a discussion here with Michael Heseltine in public discussion at the beginning of October.
But Michael Heseltine, as great a man as he is, Lord Patten, is not a young man. He's not leading that part of the Conservative Party anymore. I suppose I'm asking who are his successors?
Well,
who are your successors?
Several of them were thrown out of the party by the wretched Johnson. But
are you still a Conservative?
Sorry?
Are you still a Conservative? Do you still affiliate with the Conservative Party?
I'm still a Conservative, but I'm looking forward to the Conservative Party coming back again.
You think it's not a Conservative Party anymore?
Well, not the sort of Conservative Party which I recognise, but I'm not a Conservative. I mean, I'm a Conservative, and I don't mean by that I'm a reactionary. I think to be a Conservative involves a degree of modesty about your ability to make circumstances fit your ideas.
But aren't we living in a world where those sort of ideas of which you don't much approve, the ideas of the radical right, are very strong? I mean, even the Prime Minister the other day made a speech that some people compare to Enoch Powell. He talks about the idea of there be becoming an island of strangers. These are radical right ideas.
I think that was an unfortunate phrase, but there's certainly a way in which identity politics over the last years has been given a huge boost. First of all, by our inability to control illegal immigration, and that's an immigration in general. And this is a problem which is going to get bigger, because the demographic pressures from poor countries on richer countries are not going to go away. And we have to actually deal with it, in my view, in three ways. First of all, I'm passionately in favour of identity cards. I can't see what the argument against identity cards is. Secondly, I think we need international cooperation to deal with it. And thirdly, I think we need to have an active labour market policy, which we don't have.
Just on one other brief matter, which need not detain us for long, but you're obviously chairman of the BBC. BBC just lost its biggest star in Gary Lineker. Did you regret that?
Yeah, he's a neighbour. I like him. He's got a dog which doesn't get on too well with my dog, but that's because my dog's little and his is rather larger. I think he's... there are obvious difficulties in managing a big personality who's got strong views on things, if those views are the sort of views which the BBC itself isn't allowed to express, even though BBC journalists may share them. It's difficult to manage all that. But I think Gary Lineker's a great sports reporter. I think he did the World Cup fantastically. I think the way he handled the real human rights issues of where the World Cup was being held was superb. I think he's very, very good. And as I say, a nice and charming neighbour.
Lord Patten, it's been a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you so much.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.